46 mother bear learned sign language to communicate with deaf baby. What they did together put everyone in tears. The morning mist clung to the valleys of Yellowstone like a gentle embrace, wrapping the ancient pines in whispers of silver and gold. Jessica Brooks adjusted her binoculars for the third time, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp September air. She had been stationed at this remote research outpost for 6 months now, documenting grizzly bear behavior patterns, but nothing had prepared her for what she was witnessing through her lens. A mother grizzly sat perfectly still beside a fallen log, her massive paws moving in deliberate, measured gestures toward her small cub. The movements were too precise to be random, too purposeful to be mere play. Jessica's heart began to race as she watched the interaction unfold. The cub, smaller than most she had observed at this age, sat attentively watching his mother's every movement. His little head tilted slightly, following each gesture with an intensity that spoke of deep understanding. The mother bear's paws moved in what appeared to be a structured pattern, touching her chest, then pointing toward a cluster of berry bushes, then making a sweeping motion that seemed to encompass the entire clearing. The cub responded with his own series of movements, tiny paws mimicking some of the gestures he had just witnessed. What struck Jessica most profoundly was the silence. In all her years studying the wildlife behavior, she had never observed such quiet communication between a mother and offspring. Bear cubs were typically vocal creatures, making various sounds to communicate with their mothers. This cub made no sounds at all, yet the connection between mother and child was palpable, electric in its intensity. The mother's eyes never left her cub's face, watching for his responses with a patience that seemed almost human in its depth. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows through the forest, Jessica realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. The mother bear's gestures were not random movements, but appeared to follow a consistent pattern, a language of sorts that both animals understood perfectly. When the mother touched her nose and then pointed toward the stream, the cub immediately began moving in that direction. When she made a circular motion with her paw, he sat down and waited. Each gesture carried meaning. Each movement was a word in a conversation that transcended sound. Jessica's scientific mind raced with possibilities. She had heard of dolphins using signature whistles, of primates learning basic sign language in captivity, but this was different. This was a wild animal in her natural habitat, using what appeared to be a sophisticated system of visual communication with her offspring. The implications were staggering. If bears could develop their own form of sign language, what did this mean for our understanding of animal intelligence and adaptation? The afternoon brought new revelations as Jessica continued her observation. The mother bear's gestures became more complex as she guided her cub through their daily routine. She would touch her ear, shake her head, then point to her eyes, as if explaining that listening wasn't necessary when watching would suffice. The cub seemed to understand completely. His attention always focused on his mother's visual cues rather than any auditory signals. During feeding time, the communication became even more intricate. The mother would make a specific gesture before approaching different types of food sources. A quick tap on her chest followed by a pointing motion meant berries. A sweeping motion low to the ground indicated roots or grubs. A raised paw with fingers spread seemed to warn of potential dangers. The cub learned quickly, beginning to make these same gestures when he discovered food sources on his own, as if reporting back to his mother in their shared language. As evening approached, Jessica watched the pair settle down for rest, and even their bedtime routine involved this mysterious communication. The mother would make gentle, flowing motions with her paws, and the cub would curl up beside her, completely relaxed and secure. There was something deeply moving about watching this silent conversation, this profound connection that needed no words, no sounds, only the pure intention of love and care passing between two beings. That night, Jessica sat in her research cabin, staring at her notes and trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. The scientific part of her mind demanded logical explanations, but her heart recognized something far more profound at work. She had stumbled upon a story that challenged everything she thought she knew about animal communication and the bonds between mothers and their young. The next morning brought fresh snow and new observations. Jessica positioned herself at her usual vantage point, eager to continue documenting this remarkable behavior. The mother bear emerged from their den area, followed by her cub, and immediately began their morning communication ritual. But today, Jessica noticed something she had missed before. The cub's ears, while perfectly formed, showed no response to the various sounds of the forest. Birds called overhead, branches cracked in the wind, and a stream bubbled nearby, yet the young bear's ears never twitched or turned toward these sounds. The realization hit Jessica like a physical blow. The cub was deaf. This explained everything she had been observing. The mother bear had adapted her communication style to accommodate her offspring's hearing impairment, developing a sophisticated system of visual cues and gestures that allowed them to maintain their crucial bond. The silence Jessica had found so remarkable wasn't a choice, but a necessity, and the mother's patience and dedication took on an even deeper meaning. Over the following days, Jessica documented dozens of different gestures and their apparent meanings. The mother bear's vocabulary seemed extensive and nuanced. She had different signs for various types of danger, different movements to indicate different activities, and even what appeared to be expressions of affection and comfort. When the cub seemed distressed or confused, his mother would approach him with gentle, soothing gestures, her massive paws moving in slow, calming patterns that immediately relaxed the young bear. The emotional depth of their communication became increasingly apparent. Jessica observed moments of what could only be described as conversation, with both bears taking turns making gestures, responding to each other, and building upon shared ideas. When the cub discovered something interesting, like an unusual rock or a particularly beautiful flower, he would call his mother's attention with specific movements, and she would respond with what seemed like encouragement or shared appreciation. One particularly moving morning, Jessica watched as the cub became separated from his mother while exploring. Instead of crying out as a hearing cub might do, he climbed onto a fallen log and began making large, sweeping gestures with his paws, clearly trying to signal his location. The mother, upon noticing his absence, immediately began scanning the area visually rather than listening for calls. When she spotted his signaling, her relief was palpable as she hurried to reunite with him, her own gestures expressing what could only be interpreted as concern and love. The relationship between these two bears was rewriting Jessica's understanding of maternal instinct and adaptation. The mother had not only accepted her cub's deafness, but had found a way to turn it into an opportunity for deeper visual connection. Their communication was more intentional, more focused than typical bear interactions. Every gesture was purposeful, every movement carried weight and meaning. As weeks passed, Jessica began to notice that the cub was not just learning his mother's sign system, but was beginning to create his own variations and additions. Young animals are naturally creative, and this deaf cub was no exception. He would combine his mother's gestures in new ways, creating compound meanings or expressing more complex ideas. His mother would watch these innovations with what appeared to be pride and understanding, often incorporating his new signs into her own communication. The forest around them seemed to respond to their unique relationship. Other wildlife appeared more curious than threatened by their presence, perhaps sensing something different about this pair. Jessica noticed that birds would often perch closer to them than to other bears, and small mammals seemed less skittish in their vicinity. It was as if the peace and intentionality of their silent communication created a calmer energy that extended to the entire ecosystem around them. The changing seasons brought new challenges and new adaptations. As autumn deepened and the bears began preparing for winter, the mother's gestures became more urgent and instructional. She was teaching her cub not just how to find food and avoid danger, but how to survive the coming winter. Her lessons were detailed and patient, repeated until the young bear demonstrated understanding. Jessica realized she was witnessing not just communication but education, a sophisticated transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. The cub's progress was remarkable. Despite his hearing impairment, he was developing into a confident, capable young bear. His mother's dedication had ensured that his disability would not become a limitation. If anything, their unique communication system seemed to have strengthened their bond and enhanced the cub's observational skills. He was more visually alert than other cubs Jessica had studied, more attuned to subtle changes in his environment. As Jessica compiled her research notes, she realized that what she was documenting went far beyond animal behavior. This was a story about love overcoming obstacles, about the incredible adaptability of the maternal instinct, and about the power of communication to bridge any gap. The mother bear had not just learned to communicate with her deaf cub, she had created an entirely new language of love and care. The implications for human understanding were profound. If a wild bear could develop such sophisticated adaptive communication strategies, what did this say about the intelligence and emotional capacity of animals? How many other remarkable adaptations were occurring in the wild, unobserved and undocumented? Jessica felt the weight of responsibility to share this story, to help the world understand that the boundaries between human and animal capabilities were far more fluid than previously imagined. Winter was approaching, and Jessica knew that her time observing this remarkable pair was drawing to a close. The bears would soon enter hibernation, and she would have to wait until spring to continue her documentation. But the story she had already gathered was extraordinary, a testament to the power of love and adaptation that transcended species boundaries. The bond between this mother and cub had shown Jessica that communication is not about the medium, but about the intention. Whether through sound, sight, or touch, the desire to connect and care for one another finds a way. In the quiet forests of Yellowstone, a deaf bear cub was learning not just how to survive, but how to thrive, guided by a mother whose love had literally created a new language. As Jessica prepared her preliminary reports, she knew that this story would change how people thought about animal intelligence, about disability, and about the incredible power of maternal love. The silent conversations she had witnessed were louder than any roar, more powerful than any display of strength. They were proof that love truly knows no boundaries, and that life finds a way to flourish even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The mother bear and her deaf cub had become more than research subjects. They had become teachers, showing Jessica and potentially the world that adaptation and love could overcome any obstacle. Their story was just beginning, but already it was clear that this was a tale that would touch hearts and change minds for generations to come. Jessica's second month of observation brought deeper insights into the complexity of the communication system she was witnessing. The mother bear's gestures had evolved into what could only be described as a complete language, with grammar-like structures and consistent meanings. She would start conversations with attention-getting movements, develop ideas through sequential gestures, and conclude with what appeared to be confirmation signals that ensured her cub had understood the message. The cub's responses became increasingly sophisticated as well. He began to ask questions through gesture, expressing curiosity about new objects or situations by pointing and then making an inquiry movement with his paws. His mother would respond with explanatory gestures, sometimes demonstrating actions or using comparative movements to help him understand concepts. Jessica watched in amazement as abstract ideas like danger levels, weather changes, and even emotional states were communicated through this remarkable visual vocabulary. One morning, Jessica observed what appeared to be the bear equivalent of storytelling. The mother bear used a series of gestures to describe a past event, possibly a previous encounter with humans or other bears. She used different postures and movements to represent different characters in her story, changing her position and gesture style to indicate when she was representing herself versus others. The cub watched with rapt attention, occasionally making gestures that seemed to ask for clarification or express surprise at particular parts of the narrative. The emotional intelligence displayed in their interactions was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Jessica's observations. The mother bear had different gesture sets for different emotional contexts. Her comforting gestures were slow and flowing, her warning gestures sharp and decisive, her playful gestures bouncy and repetitive. The cub had learned to read not just the literal meaning of these gestures, but their emotional undertones, responding appropriately to his mother's mood and intentions. Weather changes brought new vocabulary to their communication system. When storms approached, the mother would make specific gestures that seemed to describe different types of weather conditions. She had distinct signs for rain, wind, snow, and temperature changes. The cub learned to associate these gestures with the actual weather patterns, eventually beginning to make weather-related gestures himself when he sensed atmospheric changes that his acute visual and tactile senses could detect. The hunting and foraging lessons became increasingly complex as autumn progressed. The mother bear's instructional gestures covered not just what to eat and where to find it, but how to evaluate food quality, how to store energy for winter, and how to balance nutritional needs. She would demonstrate digging techniques through gesture, show proper berry-picking methods, and even indicate the best times of day for different foraging activities. The cub absorbed these lessons eagerly, his own gesture vocabulary expanding to include food-related communications. Safety education was perhaps the most crucial aspect of their communication system. The mother had developed an extensive array of danger-related gestures, each indicating different types of threats and appropriate responses. She had different signs for human presence, other bears, predators, and environmental hazards. Her gestures could convey not just the presence of danger, but its severity, direction, and recommended course of action. The cub's survival would depend on mastering this critical vocabulary. Jessica began to notice that their communication system was not static, but continued to evolve and expand. Both mother and cub would experiment with new gestures, testing different movements to convey ideas. When a new gesture proved effective, it would be incorporated into their regular communication. When a gesture was unclear or ineffective, it would be modified or abandoned. This ongoing refinement suggested a level of metacognitive awareness that challenged traditional assumptions about animal intelligence. The social aspects of their communication were equally fascinating. When other bears were visible in the distance, the mother would use specific gestures to describe them to her cub, indicating their size, behavior, and potential threat level. She taught him to recognize different types of bear behavior through gesture, preparing him for future social encounters. The cub learned to communicate his own observations about other animals, developing a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics despite his hearing impairment. Play behavior revealed another dimension of their communication system. The mother and cub had developed specific gestures for initiating play, changing game rules, and ending play sessions. Their play was more structured than typical bear play, with clear communication about boundaries and intentions. This structured approach to play seemed to serve multiple purposes: bonding, physical development, and continued language learning. As winter approached, the urgency in their communications increased. The mother's gestures became more frequent and detailed as she prepared her cub for the challenges ahead. She taught him about den selection, winter behavior, and the physical and mental preparation needed for hibernation. Her lessons covered not just the practical aspects of winter survival, but seemed to include emotional preparation as well, helping her cub understand and cope with the dramatic changes that winter would bring. The cub's independence grew throughout these observations, but it was an independence built on the foundation of their strong communication system. He could venture farther from his mother because he could communicate his location and status through gesture. He could explore new situations because he had the vocabulary to describe what he encountered and ask for guidance when needed. His deafness, which could have been a severe disadvantage, had been transformed into a unique strength through his mother's dedication and innovation. Jessica's documentation revealed patterns that suggested this communication system had structure and rules similar to human sign languages. There were consistent hand shapes, movement patterns, and spatial relationships that conveyed meaning. The mother and cub used their entire bodies to communicate, incorporating posture, facial expressions, and even the positioning of their ears and tails into their gestural conversations. The learning process itself was remarkable to observe. The mother bear used repetition, demonstration, and positive reinforcement to teach new gestures. When the cub successfully used a new sign, his mother would respond with what could only be described as approval and encouragement. When he made errors, she would gently correct him, demonstrating the proper form until he achieved understanding. This patient, systematic approach to teaching challenged assumptions about animal pedagogy and learning capabilities. The emotional bond between mother and cub was strengthened rather than hindered by their unique communication needs. Their interactions were more intentional, more focused, and seemingly more intimate than typical bear relationships. Every communication required full attention and engagement from both parties, creating a level of connection that was both touching and profound to witness. As Jessica compiled her observations from these first 2 months, she realized that she had documented something unprecedented in wildlife research. This was not just adaptive behavior, but the development of a complete communication system that enabled a disabled animal not just to survive, but to thrive. The implications for understanding animal cognition, learning, and social behavior were staggering. The story unfolding before her was one of triumph over adversity, of love finding a way to overcome any obstacle, and of the remarkable adaptability of life itself. The mother bear had not just accepted her cub's deafness, she had transformed it into an opportunity for deeper connection and communication. Their silent conversations spoke volumes about the power of determination, creativity, and unconditional love. Winter was fast approaching, and Jessica knew that her current observation period was nearing its end, but the foundation she had documented would serve as the basis for continued research and would, hopefully, inspire others to look more closely at the remarkable adaptations occurring in the natural world. The deaf cub and his devoted mother had already changed Jessica's understanding of what was possible, and their story was far from over. The approaching winter brought a sense of urgency to the mother bear's teachings, and Jessica could see the intensification in their communication patterns. The gestures became more rapid, more detailed, and more frequently repeated as the mother worked to ensure her cub was fully prepared for the challenges ahead. The lessons now covered complex topics like energy conservation, den maintenance, and the psychological preparation needed for the long months of hibernation. Jessica observed what appeared to be the bear equivalent of final examinations, as the mother tested her cub's knowledge through gestural quizzes. She would present scenarios through movement and gesture, asking him to demonstrate the appropriate responses. When he answered correctly, her approval was evident in her posture and responsive gestures. When he needed correction, she would patiently repeat the lesson until understanding was achieved. The cub's confidence had grown tremendously over the months of observation. He now initiated conversations with his mother, asked complex questions through gesture, and even seemed to offer his own observations about their environment. His disability had become invisible, transformed by love and dedication into a unique strength that enhanced rather than limited his capabilities. As the first snows began to fall, Jessica watched the mother and cub prepare for their winter den. Their final communications before hibernation were tender and reassuring, with the mother using gentle, flowing gestures that seemed to promise safety and comfort through the long winter ahead. The cub responded with his own gestures of trust and love, completing a conversation that needed no words to convey its profound meaning. The last image Jessica recorded before the bears entered hibernation was of the mother and cub touching paws in what could only be described as a gesture of mutual love and understanding. They had created something beautiful together, a language born of necessity but sustained by devotion. As they disappeared into their winter den, Jessica knew she had witnessed something that would change not only her own understanding, but potentially the world's perception of animal intelligence and the power of adaptive love. The forest fell silent with the coming of winter, but the echoes of the remarkable communication Jessica had witnessed would resonate far beyond the snowy valleys of Yellowstone. The story of the deaf cub and his signing mother was just beginning, and its implications would ripple through the scientific community and touch hearts around the world. In the quiet of the winter forest, love had found a way to speak without sound, to connect without words, and to triumph over any obstacle through the simple power of understanding and care. Jessica's research notes filled multiple journals, each page documenting another aspect of this extraordinary relationship. The complexity of their communication system rivaled anything seen in captive animal studies, yet this had developed naturally in the wild, driven by necessity and sustained by love. The mother bear had become a teacher, a linguist, and a pioneer, creating new pathways of connection that transcended the traditional boundaries of animal communication. As winter settled over Yellowstone, Jessica began the process of compiling her observations into a comprehensive report. She knew that what she had witnessed would challenge existing scientific paradigms and open new avenues of research into animal cognition and communication. But beyond the scientific implications, she had been privileged to witness a story of love, adaptation, and triumph that spoke to the very heart of what it means to overcome adversity through dedication and care. The silent conversations between a mother bear and her deaf cub had spoken louder than any words, teaching lessons about the power of love to transcend any limitation and the remarkable capacity of life to adapt and thrive in the face of any challenge. Their story would continue when spring returned, but already it had become a testament to the extraordinary possibilities that emerge when love meets necessity, and determination transforms obstacles into opportunities for deeper connection. Spring arrived in Yellowstone with a gentle awakening that stirred Jessica's heart as much as it awakened the dormant landscape. She had spent the winter months analyzing her footage, cross-referencing her notes, and preparing for the continuation of her groundbreaking research. But nothing could have prepared her for the discovery that would emerge from the archived files of the park's research database. As she searched through decades of wildlife documentation, looking for any previous instances of unusual bear behavior, She stumbled upon a folder marked with a date from 15 years ago, and a name that would change everything she thought she knew about her remarkable subjects. The file belonged to Dr. Michael Hayes, a former park ranger and wildlife rehabilitator who had worked in Yellowstone during the early 2000s. As Jessica opened the digital documents, her breath caught in her throat. There, in grainy photographs and detailed rehabilitation notes, was a young female grizzly bear who had been brought to the park's wildlife center after being found injured and orphaned. The bear's description matched perfectly with the mother bear Jessica had been observing, but it was the rehabilitation notes that sent shockwaves through her understanding of everything she had witnessed. According to Dr. Hayes's meticulous records, the young female bear had been cared for by a deaf park ranger named Connor Adams. Connor had been born deaf and communicated primarily through sign language, American Sign Language. During the bear's 3-month rehabilitation period, Connor had been her primary caregiver, and his notes described something extraordinary. The young bear had begun to mimic his hand movements, showing an unusual interest in his gestural communications. At first, the behavior was dismissed as simple mimicry, but as weeks passed, it became clear that the bear was actually learning and responding to basic sign language commands. Jessica's hands trembled as she read Connor's detailed observations. The bear had learned signs for food, water, danger, and comfort. She had begun to associate specific gestures with specific outcomes, demonstrating a level of cognitive processing that amazed the rehabilitation team. When Connor would sign food, the bear would move toward her feeding area. When he signed stay, she would remain in position. Most remarkably, she had begun to create her own modified versions of the signs, adapting them to her physical capabilities while maintaining their essential meaning. The rehabilitation notes described how Connor had spent hours each day working with the young bear, not just on basic care but on communication. He had been fascinated by her apparent ability to learn sign language and had documented every breakthrough, every moment of understanding, every new gesture she mastered. His notes revealed a deep emotional connection between the deaf man and the orphaned bear, a bond forged through their shared experience of navigating a world that communicated differently than they did. As Jessica delved deeper into the files, she found video footage from the rehabilitation period. Watching the grainy recordings, she could clearly see the young bear responding to Connor's signs, making her own gestural communications, and displaying the same patient, focused attention that Jessica had observed in her interactions with her cub. The bear's release back into the wild had been bittersweet, according to Connor's notes, as he had formed a profound connection with an animal who had shared his silent world and learned to communicate within it. The implications of this discovery were staggering. The mother bear hadn't developed her sign language system spontaneously in response to her cub's deafness. She had learned the foundations of gestural communication 15 years earlier during her rehabilitation with Connor Adams. The knowledge had remained dormant, unused during her years in the wild, until the birth of her deaf cub awakened the memories and skills she had learned as a young bear. The remarkable communication system Jessica had observed wasn't just an adaptation. It was the application of learned knowledge, the resurrection of a language the mother bear had thought she would never need again. Jessica immediately began searching for Connor Adams, desperate to learn more about his experiences with the bear and to understand the full scope of what had occurred during those crucial months of rehabilitation. She found that Connor had left Park Service several years after the bear's release, but he had continued working in wildlife rehabilitation and deaf advocacy. Through a series of phone calls and emails, Jessica finally made contact with Connor, now in his 50s and working as a consultant for wildlife centers across the country. Connor's voice, transmitted through a video relay service, carried a mixture of amazement and deep emotion when Jessica described her observations. He remembered the bear vividly, describing her as one of the most intelligent animals he had ever worked with. He had often wondered what had become of her after her release, hoping that she had found her place in the wild and thrived despite the unusual circumstances of her rehabilitation. Learning that she had not only survived, but had used the communication skills he had taught her to connect with her own deaf offspring, brought tears to his eyes. Through their conversations, Jessica learned that Connor had always believed animals were capable of much more complex communication than most people realized. His experience with the bear had convinced him that the barriers between human and animal communication were far more permeable than traditional science suggested. He had documented other instances of animals learning sign language during rehabilitation, but none had shown the sustained retention and practical application that this bear had demonstrated. Connor shared additional details about the bear's learning process that illuminated Jessica's current observations. He described how the bear had shown particular aptitude for emotional and relational signs, learning not just functional communications but gestures that conveyed feelings, relationships, and abstract concepts. She had learned to sign friend, safe, happy, and sad, using these signs appropriately in context. Most remarkably, she had begun to combine signs to create more complex meanings, showing a grammatical understanding that rivaled that of primates in controlled studies. The bear's ability to generalize her learning had been evident even during rehabilitation. Connor had taught her specific signs for specific situations, but she had begun to apply these signs in new contexts, showing that she understood the underlying concepts rather than just memorizing rote responses. When she encountered new foods, she would modify the food sign to indicate different types or qualities. When she experienced different emotions, she would adapt the emotional signs to express varying degrees or nuances of feeling. Jessica realized that what she had been observing was not just remarkable adaptation, but the practical application of a sophisticated education that had occurred 15 years earlier. The mother bear had become a teacher herself, passing on the language skills she had learned from Connor to her own offspring. The communication system between mother and cub was built on the foundation of human sign language, but had evolved and adapted to meet the specific needs of wild bears living in their natural environment. The story became even more poignant when Connor shared his memories of the bear's release. He had been concerned about how she would adapt to wildlife after months of human interaction and structured communication. The rehabilitation team had worked to gradually reduce her dependence on signed communication, encouraging her to rely more on natural bear behaviors. But Connor had always wondered if she would remember the signs, if the language they had shared would remain accessible to her if she ever needed it again. The birth of her deaf cub had apparently triggered those dormant memories, awakening the communication skills that had been stored away for over a decade. The mother bear had instinctively recognized her cub's communication needs and had drawn upon her unique educational background to meet those needs. She had become a bridge between the human and animal worlds, using knowledge gained from one species to help another member of her own species thrive despite disability. Connor's insights helped Jessica understand the full complexity of what she had observed. The gestures she had documented weren't just adaptive behaviors but were modified versions of actual sign language, filtered through the mother bear's memory and adapted to her physical capabilities and environmental needs. The grammatical structures, the emotional expressions, the teaching methods she had used with her cub, all reflected the sophisticated communication system she had learned during her rehabilitation. The revelation transformed Jessica's understanding of animal intelligence, learning, and memory. This bear had not only learned a human language, but had retained that knowledge for 15 years, applied it to solve a critical problem in her own life, and successfully transmitted it to the next generation. The cognitive abilities required for such complex learning, retention, and application challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and capability. As spring progressed and the bears emerged from hibernation, Jessica observed their reunion with new understanding. The mother bear's patient teaching methods, her systematic approach to communication, her ability to break down complex concepts into manageable lessons all reflected the educational techniques Connor had used with her years earlier. She had become a student who transformed into a teacher, passing on not just survival skills but the gift of language itself. The cub's rapid learning and sophisticated responses also made more sense in this new context. He wasn't just learning an improvised communication system. He was learning a structured language with consistent rules and patterns. His mother's teaching was informed by her own systematic education, providing him with a more comprehensive and effective communication foundation than would have been possible through pure adaptation alone. Jessica's research had uncovered something unprecedented in wildlife studies: the long-term retention and practical application of learned human language by a wild animal. The implications extended far beyond this individual case, suggesting that animals might be capable of much more sophisticated learning and memory than previously understood. The boundaries between human and animal cognition appeared far more fluid than traditional science had recognized. The emotional dimension of the story deepened with this new understanding. The mother bear's dedication to her cub's communication development wasn't just maternal instinct. It was the conscious application of knowledge she had gained through her own experience of being different, of needing alternative forms of communication. Her relationship with Connor had prepared her to understand and address her cub's needs in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. Connor's role in the story added another layer of meaning to the remarkable events Jessica had witnessed. His patient work with a young, orphaned bear had created ripples that extended across decades and generations. His commitment to communication and understanding had planted seeds that bloomed years later in the form of a mother's love for her disabled cub. The deaf man's gift of language had become a deaf cub's pathway to survival and connection. The scientific community would undoubtedly be amazed by Jessica's findings, but the human story embedded within the research was equally compelling. It was a testament to the power of education, the persistence of memory, and the ways in which acts of kindness and understanding can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate context. Connor's work with the bear had been motivated by compassion and curiosity, but it had ultimately enabled the survival and thriving of a new generation. As Jessica continued her observations through the spring and summer, she watched the mother bear's teaching methods with new appreciation for their sophistication and effectiveness. Every gesture, every lesson, every patient correction reflected not just maternal dedication, but professional expertise gained through her own educational experience. The cub was receiving not just a mother's love, but a structured education in communication that would serve him throughout his life. The relationship between the three participants in this remarkable story, Connor, the mother bear, and her cub, represented a unique form of intergenerational and interspecies connection. Knowledge had passed from human to bear and then from bear to bear, creating a chain of communication and understanding that transcended the traditional boundaries between species. The deaf cub's ability to thrive in the wild was built on a foundation of human compassion and scientific curiosity that had occurred 15 years before his birth. Jessica's documentation of this story would contribute to multiple fields of study: animal cognition, interspecies communication, wildlife rehabilitation, disability studies, and the long-term effects of human-animal interaction. But beyond its scientific value, the story represented something profoundly hopeful about the possibilities for understanding and connection across all the boundaries that typically divide us. The mother bear had kept Connor's gift alive in her memory for 15 years, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. When that moment came, she had drawn upon her education to become an educator herself, ensuring that her cub would have every opportunity to succeed despite his disability. The chain of communication and care that connected Connor to the mother bear to her cub demonstrated the far-reaching effects of compassion and the unexpected ways in which knowledge and love can persist and multiply across time and species. As autumn approached once again, Jessica prepared to share her complete findings with the world. The story she would tell was not just about remarkable animal behavior, but about the power of education, memory, and love to overcome any obstacle. The deaf cub, who had learned to communicate through sign language, was thriving because of a chain of care and understanding that stretched back 15 years to a deaf park ranger who had seen potential in an orphaned bear and had taken the time to unlock it. The revelation of Connor's role in the story had transformed Jessica's research from a study of animal adaptation into a meditation on the persistence of knowledge, the power of memory, and the ways in which acts of compassion can have consequences that ripple across decades and generations. The silent conversations between mother and cub that had first captured Jessica's attention were revealed to be part of a much larger conversation about communication, understanding, and the remarkable capacity of all living beings to learn, grow, and care for one another. The approaching winter would once again separate Jessica from her subjects, but the story she had uncovered would continue to unfold in ways that would touch hearts and change minds around the world. The deaf bear cub and his signing mother had become symbols of hope and possibility, living proof that love finds a way to overcome any obstacle, and that the gifts we give to others can have impacts far beyond our ability to imagine or measure. The final months of Jessica's extended observation period brought a deeper understanding of how the remarkable communication system between the mother bear and her cub had evolved and flourished. With the knowledge of Connor's foundational role in the mother bear's education, Jessica could now interpret the subtle nuances and sophisticated elements of their interactions with greater clarity. The mother bear wasn't just adapting to her cub's needs, she was drawing upon a comprehensive educational foundation to provide him with the most complete communication system possible. As winter preparations began once again, Jessica observed the mother bear teaching her now adolescent cub increasingly complex concepts through their shared sign language. The lessons had evolved from basic survival skills to abstract concepts like time, relationships, and even what appeared to be discussions about the cub's future independence. The mother would use temporal gestures to discuss seasonal changes, relational signs to describe their bond and his eventual need for autonomy, and complex combinations of movements to convey sophisticated ideas about life in the wild. The cub, now confident and capable, had begun to contribute his own innovations to their communication system. He had developed signs for concepts and experiences that were uniquely his own, expanding the vocabulary beyond what his mother had learned from Connor years earlier. His contributions showed creativity, abstract thinking, and a deep understanding of how language could be used to express not just needs and observations, but feelings, ideas, and even dreams about the future. Jessica documented moments of what could only be described as philosophical conversation between the two bears. The mother would use gestures to pose questions about the cub's preferences, his understanding of their world, and his thoughts about various experiences. The cub would respond with sophisticated combinations of signs that revealed complex thinking and emotional depth. These conversations challenged every assumption about animal consciousness and the capacity for abstract thought in non-human species. The relationship between mother and cub had evolved into something that transcended typical animal-family dynamics. They had become intellectual companions, communication partners, and co-creators of a unique linguistic system. Their bond was strengthened by their shared language, but their language was also enriched by the depth of their emotional connection. Each informed and enhanced the other in a continuous cycle of growth and understanding. Connor, who had remained in contact with Jessica throughout her research, was amazed by the developments she described. The bear he had worked with 15 years earlier had not only retained and applied her learning, but had become an innovator and teacher in her own right. She had taken the foundation he had provided and built upon it in ways that exceeded anything he had imagined possible. Her success as a mother and educator validated his belief in the remarkable potential of animal intelligence and the power of patient, respectful communication. The scientific implications of Jessica's complete findings were revolutionary. She had documented the first known case of a wild animal retaining and applying learned human language over an extended period, then successfully transmitting that knowledge to offspring. The cognitive abilities required for such complex learning, memory, retention, and teaching suggested that the gap between human and animal intelligence was far smaller than traditionally believed. But beyond the scientific significance, the story had become a powerful testament to the enduring nature of love, education, and hope. Connor's compassionate work with an orphaned bear had created a legacy that extended across generations. His patient teaching had given the mother bear tools she would later use to ensure her own cub's success and happiness. The chain of care and communication that connected all three participants demonstrated the far-reaching effects of kindness and the unexpected ways in which our actions can influence the future. The mother bear's transformation from student to teacher illustrated the cyclical nature of learning and growth. She had received the gift of communication from Connor, had carried it within her for years, and had then passed it on to her cub in an enhanced and adapted form. Each participant in the chain had contributed something unique, creating a system of communication and care that was greater than the sum of its parts. As Jessica prepared to conclude her field research, she realized that the story she had documented would have impacts far beyond the scientific community. The tale of the deaf cub who learned to sign, the mother who remembered her lessons across 15 years, and the deaf man whose compassion had made it all possible would inspire people around the world to reconsider their assumptions about animal intelligence, the persistence of memory, and the power of education to transcend any barrier. The approaching winter would mark the end of Jessica's direct observation, but it would also mark the beginning of a new chapter in the story. The cub was now old enough and skilled enough to survive on his own, equipped with a sophisticated communication system and the confidence that comes from being truly understood and valued. His mother had successfully prepared him for independence while ensuring that he would never be isolated by his deafness. The legacy of Connor's work with the mother bear had multiplied exponentially. His patient teaching of one orphaned animal had ultimately enabled the survival and thriving of another generation. The knowledge he had shared had been preserved, adapted, and passed on, creating a living testament to the power of education and the remarkable capacity of animals to learn, remember, and teach. Jessica's final observations documented the emotional farewell between mother and cub as they prepared for the natural separation that would mark the young bear's transition to independence. Their parting communications were tender and complex, involving not just practical instructions for survival, but expressions of love, pride, and hope for the future. The mother's signs conveyed confidence in her cub's abilities and assurance that he carried within him everything he needed to succeed. The cub's farewell gestures expressed gratitude, love, and understanding of the remarkable gift his mother had given him. He had learned not just how to communicate, but how to connect, not just how to survive, but how to thrive, not just how to adapt to his disability, but how to transform it into a unique strength. The sign language that had begun as a necessity had become a celebration of the possibilities that emerge when love meets knowledge and determination transforms obstacles into opportunities. As Jessica packed her research equipment and prepared to leave Yellowstone, she carried with her a story that would change how the world understood animal intelligence, the power of memory, and the far-reaching effects of compassion. The silent conversations she had witnessed and documented had spoken volumes about the capacity for growth, learning, and love that exists in all living beings. The deaf bear cub who had learned to sign was now ready to make his own way in the world, equipped with skills and confidence that would serve him throughout his life. His mother had fulfilled her role as educator and guide, successfully preparing her offspring for independence, while ensuring that Connor's gift of communication would live on in a new generation. The chain of care and understanding that connected all three participants in this remarkable story would continue to influence and inspire long after their individual stories had ended. The winter forest would soon embrace the bears in its quiet sanctuary, but the echoes of their remarkable journey would resonate far beyond the snowy valleys of Yellowstone. Jessica's research had uncovered a story of hope, adaptation, and the enduring power of love to overcome any challenge. The deaf cub and his signing mother had become symbols of possibility, living proof that with patience, dedication, and the willingness to see beyond traditional limitations, any obstacle can be transformed into an opportunity for deeper connection and understanding. The story of the mother bear, who learned sign language to communicate with her deaf baby, had revealed itself to be part of a much larger narrative about the persistence of knowledge, the power of memory, and the ways in which acts of compassion can have consequences that extend across decades and species. It was a story that would touch hearts, change minds, and inspire new possibilities for understanding and connection in a world that too often focuses on differences rather than the common threads that bind all living beings together in the great web of life.